I was there at the start. I was there before we even had names for all the things we're doing now. I have no congregation anymore, but I will again. The faithful will come back, thirsty for accounts of how this feat was achieved, and I will have stories waiting for them. Such stories. Stories that will make their ears bleed and their hearts burst. So it's not done yet, Erebus. Not yet. Just watch. Just watch. Greetings, friends, and welcome to the Imperium's Most Wanted. I'm Lorcan, and this is OnlyWar. In this episode we will discuss one of the most infamous names in the universe, a man whose actions would alter the very course of humanity, and echo down the millennia. He had the ear of some of the most powerful beings of the Imperium, and used that influence to drip his poison into their minds, corrupting them into turning from the light of the Emperor and delivering them into the service of his dark, chaotic masters. Masters he had served long before he ever laid sight on his golden Primarch. He was the first chaplain of the Word Bearers, the Hand of Destiny, and the harbinger of the Horus heresy. While his influence may have waned since the darkest days of the civil war that saw brother turn on brother in the most unspeakable treachery, his continued existence is an affront to all who remain loyal to the Emperor of mankind. He is Erebus, and his name will be cursed forevermore. Before we begin, a huge thanks to the supporters on Patreon and those who have donated to the channel either through Super Thanks or the affiliate links in the description. Also a huge thanks to everyone who commented and helped push out the last video. It makes a huge difference in the blessed algorithm. If at any point you feel the need to curse the name of Erebus during this tale, make sure to hit the like, leave your curse in the comments, and if you found us for the first time, I hope I earn your subscription today. Our story begins on the desert world of Colchis. At 3 times the size of Terra, but with a fraction of the population, its thirsty continent suffered under a merciless sun, each diurnal cycle taking a Terran week. Its surface was dominated by urban desert plains and unforgiving mountain ranges, where only the few threading rivers that gave life to the plains were born. However, just like the world that would become Terra, over the generations, civilizations rose along these life-giving water courses, and cities formed mostly hugging the coastline of the parched continental masses. Each of these city-states maintained links to the others through sky trade and ocean freight, as traveling directly over land on the ever-changing sands would swiftly lead to disaster. Colchis bore the scars of lost great civilizations, cities lost to the mists of time and never resettled as new ones arose elsewhere, supporting a simpler culture laced with superstition. The human population met their most vital need for water, supported by immense filtration facilities, irrigation farming, and making the best possible use of the seasonal floods. It was onto this dusty, thirsty world that a child was born to simple parents. The name they gave their son is now forgotten to everyone but himself. However, he would soon adopt the name for which he would become infamous across the Imperium of man. Here, amid the oppressive heat, the boy would show the first signs of what he was to become. He would sit for hours in the shade of his parents' house, waiting for the local scorpions to seek refuge there. He would catch them with his bare hands, then watch them struggle as he plucked their limbs from their segmented bodies. Sometimes he would suffer stings that would leave him racked with fever and tormented by hallucinations and visions, but once recovered he would return to his game. His humble parents despaired, longing for their son to learn a trade and advance himself, but their son had no desire to rise through honest toil. wishing the trappings of wealth and power through the easiest means possible, and soon his observant nature led him to the way to make this a reality. He noticed the provincial priests of the Covenant were far from paragons of virtue, drinking, gambling, and using violence to amass wealth for their personal palaces rather than their temples of worship. This life greatly appealed to the young man. However, for all their corruption and decadence, the clerics held tight to their power. Only the well-connected were sent to the seminaries and taught to read the old texts and perform the Covenant's rites and rituals. Without the social status required to gain permission to enter, the boy would sneak around the oratories, listening to the chants and learning the patterns to the words. Later, he would steal books from the scriptoria, and bit by bit he would begin to piece together the litanies of their faith, committing them to memory, coming very naturally to him. His parents knew nothing of this clandestine study, and in exasperation at his apparent idleness, his mother implored why he couldn't be more like a local, pious young man who had taken to inking sacred glyphs from the holy books onto his face and shaven head with dedication, and becoming something of an inspiration to those in the settlement. A young man bearing the name Erebus. This young man would soon find himself the first victim of a sadistic killer. Garroted in a back alley, his possessions plundered for the few things his killer would need to assume his identity. That evening, in stolen robes with a dead man's script neatly inked on his shaven head, the boy now bearing the name Erebus would leave his hometown behind. With his new persona complete with stolen papers and his skills in subterfuge, Erebus was soon ensconced in a new institution, learning as little of the genuine theology as he could, but keenly observing how the priests maintained discipline in the houses of the faith, and how their words and deeds brought about supplication of the faithful. These were the last days of the old faith. Rumors of an army sweeping across the desert commanded by a golden prophet, who it was said would cast out the old powers worshipped by the Covenant. The priests became fearful, but their impassioned litanies and protestations could not sway a population that had witnessed generations of excess and cruelty. A strange thing then happened to the young Erebus. He began to find himself finding deeper meaning of all the rites and homilies he had paid the barest lip service to previously. He found himself studying in fascination not due to some religious epiphany, but in seeing how his own skills and desires aligned even more closely than he'd ever imagined with preaching their religious dogma. It was around this time the young man would be observing a blood ritual in one of the old mud brick temples that Erebus would catch first sight of the presences that used the Covenant as their plaything. Presences he knew had lingered at the edges, observing his minor cruelties and blood-stained rise. Presences he could still be of great service to in the millennia to come. The reflection he saw in those tarnished altar mirrors was of the four ruinous powers of chaos. So when the Golden Prophet arrived at the gates of his city, accompanied by his adopted father Corphoron, at the head of his army of fanatical followers to bring enlightenment to the population, Erebus did not fall to his knees in either elation or despair. Despite being in the presence of an apparent demigod, Lorgar, the future Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, Erebus only saw one thing, a bigger scorpion, but he would have to bide his time if he was to get close to this one without being stung. The coming of Lorgar Aurelian, the Golden One, sent the Covenant underground, gathering and storing what they needed for their purpose, becoming stronger through secrecy while appearing to conform to the new order. Erebus thrived on the clandestine deception and revelled in the silent murders in the dark. Both the words of the prophet and their own dark rituals foretold of the coming of the master of mankind to Colchis, to be reunited with his lost son. Erebus longed to see this godlike being who would seek to shape the future of humanity. He knew his destiny was to bring him low in the service of his real masters, and even when he was in the presence of the Emperor of Mankind, he claims he was never taken in by him. I knew right from the start. I knew before he even set foot on my dry as bones home world. I knew all this because I'd never aspired to be anything other than what I am. An eavesdropper. A sneak. A febrile soak-away for lies and poison. Judge me if you will, and plenty do, but we all have our places within this far from ideal creation. Here I stand. I can do no other. Erebus was selected to undergo the process of becoming an Astartes, a transition he would find not only physically painful but also blasphemous despite the physical gifts his new form would bestow. Many of those steeped in the ways of the Covenant perished badly, but Erebus would survive and train to fight as a gene-enhanced Astartes of the Legion. He would admit to seeing the allure of the Imperial project, a universe of material extravagance bound to the laws of science and divorced from the spiritual. But the temptation to deviate from the path of dark corruption was fleeting. The Legion he was now a part of was mostly of atheist Terran origin, and even the Colchosians were divided into those loyal to the old faith and the new ideologies of their Primarch. The passages he would inscribe on his flesh would be carefully selected to negotiate these subtleties, passages that could be interpreted in a number of ways depending on the whims of the reader. He and his brothers who held to their deep-held beliefs patiently waited, working themselves slowly into positions of influence in the Legion. Once the word-bearers were mustered to join the Great Crusade, and he first made for the emptiness of the stars, he felt all the truths he had known in abstract on Colchis made real. He felt the flow of the Imperium around the starships he travelled in. On making the journey into warp space, he knew he was travelling in the very realm of the powers themselves, and found the self-deception of all who denied their existence absurd. The audaciousness and speed of the Great Crusade was surprising to Erebus. He saw how the rapid execution of the Emperor's plan could stop others from pausing and seeing the contradictions inherent in his imperial truth, and the final banishment from the material universe of the dark gods whose existence the Master of Mankind denied could indeed be at hand. However, Erebus claims he would feel the agents of two divergent futures being moved into position, the Pantheon more aligned in a single purpose than ever before, and the violence being unleashed across the galaxy in the name of uniting humanity, fueling his patron deities. I never lost that feeling. The Pantheon has remained close to me ever since. Whatever lies you may have heard from my enemies, I have never been their stated champion. Not like Horus. But I have always been their servant, their counselor to the mighty, their assassin, their advisor, their deliverer of souls. Consistency, that's what they value. Perhaps because they are ever-changing, they will reward the mind that never wavers in its commitment. Or maybe that is a lie too. Most things are when traced back to their beginning. And so fate brought the word-bearers alongside the lunar wolves to another parched planet of shifting sands, the world of Davin. Unlike Colchis, the inhabitants of Davin had deviated far from the human genetic norm, as if something had been moulding them for a dark purpose. While the word-bearers saw apt disciples for faith in the God Emperor of Mankind, Erebus had already received the portents of what he would find hidden there. Guided by murmurs and whispers from the ether, Erebus came to a ruined temple of mud brick and masonry. He could see the fallen magnificence in those ruins, an octagonal city temple of extraordinary size and complexity made with a raw understanding of the link between the material realm and the immaterium beyond. There he found an old priest who led him past depictions of angels fighting demons, monsters writhing in combat with knights, and multiple depictions of a golden armoured warrior, his face scratched out crudely and replaced by a single eye, brought to a larger chamber with a stone altar at the centre surrounded by 4 ritual pillars, the place where on their return to Davin, Horus would be brought into the service of the gods of chaos. In that place he also met a young child by the name of Akshub, who would play a key part in that fateful moment, and repeated in the frescoes all around an image, drawn from the visions of these long-lost priests. A blade, apparently little more than crudely fashioned flint, but with an innate otherworldly quality evident even in these coarse etchings. A blade he would need to find, while on his orders the temple on Davin was to be rebuilt. The compliance of Davin was swift. Despite being virtually a feral world compared to some, Davin was controlled by a remarkable warrior caste, whose savage nobility won the respect of the 2 Astartes legions sent to pacify them. The Davinite warriors had ruled their world through a quasi-religious structure of warrior lodges, the tenets of which appealed to the nature of the Astartes of the Lunar Wolves and the Word-Bearers. With the subtle influence of Erebus and others, lodge practices were quietly absorbed into these 2 legions. Lorgar and the Word-Bearers would be sent out on the Great Crusade on their own expedition fleets soon enough, and amongst the populations of the worlds brought into compliance by his legion, the Primarch was known as the Anointed, the 17th Son, and the Bearer of the Word. However, in bringing worlds into compliance, the methods employed by Lorgar and his Word-Bearers were brought into question by the Emperor himself. The 17th Legion was slow in its conquests, spending significant time after compliance was achieved, ensuring the population was indoctrinated into the imperial faith that led to the worship of the Emperor as a god, rather than the secular imperial truth the Emperor desired. Eventually the Master of Mankind would send Rabute Gilliman and the Ultramarines to the world of Kur, brought into compliance by the World-Bearers and held up by them, particularly the capital city Monarchia, as a perfect city celebrating the imperial faith of Lorgar. The Ultramarines would destroy Monarchia via a devastating orbital bombardment, allowing the citizens to evacuate and to send only one distress signal shortly before the bombardment began. This signal they sent to the Word-Bearers, who soon rushed in an attempt to save the devout population and their beautiful city. Arriving too late, the Word-Bearers then faced further humiliation as they were forced by the presence of the Emperor himself to kneel, both Primarch and Legion, including First Chaplain Erebus, in the ashes of Monarchia, while the Ultramarines and their Primarch stood by the Emperor's side. The rebuke the Emperor gave Lorgar and his sons was severe and humiliating, stating that they were guilty of failure, their large legion slower in their conquests and leading the populations of those worlds into the worship of a false faith. If he had truly hoped for their legion to learn from this mistake and be reborn, as he stated, he had sorely underestimated the great pain his words and the manner of his rebuke would cause Lorgar. Lorgar's crisis of faith following the rebuke at Monarchia would be taken full advantage of by his adopted father and first captain Corpharon and Erebus. Between the 2 of them they convinced Lorgar that while his writings on the divinity of the Emperor held true, just being divine did not make him worthy of worship. Erebus warned that while the Legion's chaplain's faith remained unshaken by the events on Kur, they needed the guidance of their Primarch to reassure the rest of the Legion that they were still on the right path. Corpharon admitted he saw the Emperor as divine but never benevolent, reeking, as he said, of bloodshed, domination, and worlds burnt at his command. He said he wondered even then if they were waging a war in error, butchering the old faith of Colchis, which was so similar to that found on other worlds, to replace it with a false one. Erebus would go on to flatter his Primarch by saying his strengths were that he embodied the hope in the Emperor, the belief that mankind could be raised up to achieve its greatest potential, and his selfless dedication to that goal. But of his flaws, Erebus would say it was his faith in others, his selfless devotion and unbreakable loyalty, causing him grief beyond the ability of even a Primarch to endure. Lorgar contemplated their words and came to the conclusion they were leading him to, that all he had achieved was indeed a lie, that he could be a visionary rather than a simple soldier as his father tasked him to be. He had prayed to the wrong god for the right reasons, and he could yet atone for his actions. Corphoron suggested they must purge the root of their errors by returning first to Colchis and restoring the old faith, and then do the same to the other worlds they brought into compliance. Erebus finished their advice by saying that they could install the ways of the old faith in all the worlds they would conquer in the future, rather than the worship of the Emperor or the lie of the imperial truth. Erebus would seal his Primarch's fate by convincing him to have the Legion embark on the Great Pilgrimage under the guise of continuing the Great Crusade, to search for the gods they had so long denied. Erebus would sway Lorgar by saying if the Primarch had abandoned his belief in the divine, that there was no truth in the old ways, and that mankind could indeed prosper without faith, then to end his life, as he had no wish to live if every principle that had guided their legion was to be cast aside. Lorgar was swayed to the path they laid out before him, his faith wounded but his beliefs still intact. Erebus supported Corphoron's final suggestion that Lorgar spoke to one of his closest brothers, and the one with whom Lorgar had spent long hours discussing the nature of the universe, Magnus, before undertaking their pilgrimage to find the gods of the old faith. Erebus would be tasked with taking the word of Lorgar's new mindset to the Legion's chaplains, while the Primarch sequestered himself to write the tenets of a new faith, the Book of Lorgar. Lorgar would speak with Magnus on his return to Colchis. The Lord of the Word-Bearers would seek answers of his brother on the nature of the Imperium, questioning Magnus whether on all his journeys through the great ocean he had ever seen anything that humanity could perceive as gods or demons. He implored Magnus to help him seek the truth that lays beyond, to join his pilgrimage to find the place where the stars were stained with divine influence, to help him understand the voices that call out to him day and night. Magnus would neither reveal what secrets he knew of the warp, nor would he join Lorgar's pilgrimage. He warned Lorgar that only misery awaited him if he continued on his chosen path, but the Word-Bearer's Primarch would not be dissuaded. Erebus and Corphoron would guide Lorgar in becoming more attuned to the siren call of the voices from the void, and Erebus would also direct him towards leaving the 47th Expedition Fleet under the command of Corphoron, and instead joining Erebus's former student Argel Tal on the 1301st Fleet as the 17th Legion scattered across the stars, travelling to the very edges of the Imperium and beyond, in search of the primordial truth. The pilgrimage revealed many truths, the flaws written into the Legion's precious gene seed, the arcane gestation of Lorgar Aurelian himself, the existence of the Neverborn, named as demons, spirits, and angels by 1,000,000 ignorant generations of mankind. But the greatest truth revealed was also the hardest to accept, and it broke a Primarch's heart. And of course it changed his sons. The Word-Bearers could never go back to a time before the truth. We will not dwell too long into the events on Cadia that saw Lorgar send first Argel Tarn into the Eye of Terror to join the demon Ram and become the first of the possessed, or his own journey there to finally discover the truth of the existence of the ruinous powers and their version of the events of the past and portents of the future. What he truly saw in the eye is a source of near infinite speculation, but from that time Lorgar was left with one belief above all others, that only faith could save mankind from the fate he had seen, and that faith was not in the Emperor or his vision. Only the worship of the great powers of the warp could deliver humanity from eventual extinction. After venturing into the Great Eye, Lorgar was distraught. His faith in the Emperor was already destroyed, and the truth he found at the galaxy's edge tormented him as much as it inspired him. Indecision gripped him for months. Corphoron took command of the fleet for a second time, and they did little but vent their wrath across the worlds they came across. Despite Lorgar's return, the Legion felt no joy from the Primarch's presence. In truth, the Aurelian wasn't certain humanity was ready to learn of such horrors. Over the next 40 years, Erebus would do his Primarch's bidding mostly from afar, spreading the word of Lorgar to worlds conquered by the Word-Bearers and ensuring the spread and corruption of the warrior lodges in the Astartes legions through his fellow chaplains. It would take most of those final years of the Great Crusade before Erebus would finally discover the location of the blade he had seen in the frescoes of the ruined temple on Davin. The first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, a rank equivalent to Lord Commander or First Captain in the others. He would join up with the Lunar Wolves once more, shortly after Horus had been elevated to War Master. Erebus was by now a somber and serious figure, but his quiet manner and soft composed voice commanded instant respect, and despite the differences in manner with the warlike Lunar Wolves, they had warmly welcomed his presence among them, just as the relationship between the two legions had been close since their days on the Great Crusade together. Time, it appeared, had fashioned Erebus into as much a statesman as it had a warrior, and he conducted both duties with superlative skill. He had been sent to Horus at the behest of Lorgar, however the purpose of his arrival was never truly determined. It was felt that on his arrival Erebus had empathetically put aside any requests he may have been tasked to make of the War Master, seeing the pressures he was already under, and instead just lent his counsel and advice to Horus, as his gene-sire Lorgar would have done. For this, the Mournival, the most trusted and senior of the Lunar Wolves' captains, admired him greatly, and welcomed him into that inner circle. Many had fought alongside Erebus in many theatres of war, and spoke only highly of him. He further integrated himself with them by dining and drinking with them, and even entering the sparring cages and besting some of their number. In fact, despite his own claims not to be the greatest warrior, it was in those cages he even earned some modicum of respect from Captain Lucius of the Emperor's Children, lasting nearly 16 minutes in a bout against the renowned swordsman. Erebus's arrival came shortly after the war on the planet christened Murder by the Astartes that fought against the mega-arachnid species they found there, and first contact with the technologically advanced civilization of genetically and surgically enhanced humans known as the Interrex, who had tried to leave harmonic warnings not to approach the planet they had designated as a homeworld reservation for that deadly species. The Interrex had a philosophy similar in many ways to the Tau, in which they sought to end conflicts with the Xenos species they encountered without resorting to driving those races to extinction. Early in their history, they engaged in a territorial war lasting a century with a species known as the Kinebranc. The Kinebranc were an ancient but fading race of simian-like beings that had been an interstellar culture for over 15,000 years when first contact was made. Despite their superior technology, the Interrex were victorious. But in victory, instead of annihilating their former foes, they developed a means of interspecies communication, a type of high mathematics that transcended linguistic barriers known as the Aria, and elected to offer the Kinebranc a means of rapprochement. The Kinebranc would become client citizens under the protection of the expanding Interrex Empire, and in return they would share their technological secrets willingly. This accord had lasted for 3,000 years when the Great Crusade arrived at the edge of their empire. A summit was proposed whereby the War Master and his entourage would travel to the nearest Interrex outpost planet, and parley with envoys of the Interrex, as they were clearly a human civilization of some power, occupying a significant portion of space, believed to be in excess of 30 systems. The gateway planet of Zenobia was selected, a sentinel station on the edge of interact space, and Horus and his entourage were conducted to Zenobia Primus, a wealthy, regal city that was far from the fortress they might have expected. A great parade greeted the Imperial delegation, which culminated in their presentation to a senior royal officer, a military general commander named Jeptar Nod. And alongside the deliberately displayed military elements of the Interrex, the general citizenry also came out in force to welcome them. The parade's destination was a building called the Hall of Devices, which resembled a museum despite having obvious military significance. Nord explained that the hall was both a museum and an armory, with all manner of weapons spanning their history and collected from alien cultures they had encountered, secured under protective energy fields. Of the Kinebranc artifacts on display, very few resembled weapons as the visiting Astartes would recognize them. However, there were what appeared to be long daggers or swords of a simple but exotic design amongst the collection. These, Nord revealed, were blades of sentient metal, which they called anathemas, crafted by a now forbidden technique. When such a blade was selected for a particular target, it would become that target's nemesis, and utterly deadly to the person or being chosen. The exact means by which this was achieved was said to be beyond technical evaluation. The negotiations with the Interrex would draw on for 3 weeks, with some in the Imperial delegation questioning whether their society had deviated too far from the model of human culture proclaimed by the Emperor, particularly in their approach to incorporating Xenos species into their society. But the diplomatic negotiations would come to an abrupt halt when an attack occurred at the Hall of Devices. Unbeknownst to Horus, Erebus had taken the opportunity to break away from the formal delegation and had entered the Hall of Devices, killing its custodian and setting the building on fire to cover that he had stolen the one weapon that had caught his attention amongst their collection. The weapon depicted in the visions of the artisans in the ancient frescoes of the ruined temple on Davin, the Kinebranc Anathema Blade. In the darkest vaults of the vengeful spirit, by the light of a single candle, Erebus would admire the strange blade that would alter the fate of the cosmos, and stored it away in a special casket while he enacted the next part of his plan. The first chaplain now appeared to reveal his purpose in joining the now newly renamed Sons of Horus, and asked the War Master to take the 63rd Expedition Fleet on a brief detour to settle a minor dispute on a small moon in the Davin system. It had been 60 years since Davin had been brought into compliance by the then Lunar Wolves and Wordbearers, their feral warriors impressing the Astartes with their courage and willingness once defeated to accept the new order of their society. Then Commander Horus had decreed his warriors could learn much from these primitive tribesmen, and the warrior lodge practices had been adopted into the legions as a result, while Corpharon, Lorgar's adopted father, had been left to complete the task of bringing the light of truth and enlightenment to Davin. While Erebus had spoken of a dispute needing to be settled, he had not revealed the cause or participants, and it was soon obvious there was no wide-scale warfare on Davin. Horus had known no peace since the bloodshed amid the House of Devices on Zenobia. The death toll and the missed opportunity of unification with the Interrex haunted him. The War Master had withdrawn into a sullen melancholy, remaining more and more within his inner sanctum, with only Erebus to counsel him. The Mournival had barely seen their commander since returning to Imperial space, and they all keenly felt their exclusion from his presence. Where once they had offered the War Master their guidance, now only Erebus whispered in his ear. Thus it was with some relief that the Mournival heard that Erebus would take his leave of the expedition and journey ahead with his own legion to Davin. Erebus would return to meet the War Master and the members of the Mournival on the surface of Davin, and it was here, in a flagrant breach of etiquette, that he would correct Horus during his address and reveal that Davin was no longer in compliance. Since taking counsel from the first chaplain, Horus had become more withdrawn but also sullen and prone to anger. The word-bearer's growing influence had raised concern, and now this show of insolence and dishonour aroused those suspicions further. Erebus would manipulate Horus into travelling in person to Davin's Moon by revealing that the Imperial Army commander, Yugen Temba, a man chosen personally by the War Master to oversee the completion of Davin compliance, had turned traitor and no longer recognized the Emperor as his lord and master. Erebus revealed that Temba had led his men to Davin's Moon, where the tribes there had refused to accept compliance. Once there, the tribes of the Moon had employed what the ancient texts described as sorcery, to twist the perceptions of Temba and his men and turn them against Horus, leading him to spit on his oaths of loyalty to the Emperor and denounce Horus as a lackey of a fallen god. The performance of Erebus, as this was what it was, in delivering this news had the desired effect, as Horus was enraged by this slight to his honour and ordered a spear-tip strike to be assembled that he would personally lead to Davin's Moon. Captain Garviel Loken, newest member of the Mournival, was particularly suspicious of Erebus's apparent manipulation, especially on finding out it had been Erebus who started the secretive warrior lodge at the heart of the now Sons of Horus, to which the rest of the Mournival belonged. Loken had confronted Erebus in private a week before reaching Davin, while the first chaplain was still aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Loken asked him about his knowledge of the warp and, more importantly, the existence of chaos that he had discussed with one of the Interex commanders just prior to the attack on the Hall of Devices. Erebus would attempt to deflect Loken from the truth he was starting to piece together by stating the warp was nothing more than mindless energy churning in constant turmoil. Erebus denounced tales of sorcery and dark entities of the warp as primitive fiction, although his accidental slip, revealing the theft of the anathema in trying to discredit the words of the Interex commander, brought Loken's suspicions about the first chaplain to the fore. Erebus would continue to manipulate the situation on Davin's Moon, leading them to Temba's flagship, the Glory of Terror, and the source of a mocking communication transmission that further enraged the War Master. Horus was casting caution to the wind just as Erebus planned when he made his way into the vessel to confront Temba personally. The being he found that was once Yugen Temba was greatly corrupted by Nurgle, and now an immense monstrosity of corpulent flesh barely recognizable as the man Horus once knew. In one hand, the creature that was once Temba held a primitive-looking blade with a glitter-like sheen, the Anathema, stolen by Erebus and prevented to Temba once the first chaplain had taken his leave in advance of their arrival at Davin. Powered by the gods of chaos, Temba was now possessed with a horrifying skill with the blade, and able to move with speed and dexterity that belied his bloated bulk. It took all of Horus's skill to best the former officer, but in moving to deliver the killing stroke, Temba was able to land a single blow to Horus's shoulder with the anathema. While causing Horus great pain, the wound appeared superficial at first, although on his way out from the Glory of Terror, Horus would collapse afflicted by some terrible malaise that would leave his sons baffled. In the hopes of finding the cause, Captain Loken would go back to the surface with his close friend Captain Trogodon to retrieve the anathema, and in doing so left Erebus to use the warrior lodge he founded all those decades ago amongst the then Lunar Wolves to steer their next course of action. Using his influence with the other members of the Mournival and high-ranking officers of the lodge, Erebus told them that Horus was dying and that only they had the power to prevent it. The first captain convinced them to travel to the temple of a particular lodge where the priests were skilled in the mystic arts of healing, the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin. Using the term mystic raised their suspicion of further sorcery, but Erebus had most likely done this intentionally, making them place the War Master's return to health above any reservations they might have about the means used to do so. In finding and identifying the Anathema Blade, Loken and Trogodon knew that Erebus must have been responsible for it finding its way there, for the purpose of gravely wounding the War Master, but by then Horus had already been transferred to the care of the priests of the Serpent Lodge known as Delphos. In the temple chamber where Erebus had walked all those years prior, Akshub, the young girl he met then, now the high priestess of the Delphos temple, performed the sacrifice and rituals to draw on the power of the four ruinous gods. With Horus's soul now free in the void, the final part of Erebus's plan was to enter himself and show the War Master the truth of his origin and the betrayal of the father in whose name he had conquered half the galaxy. In order to do so, Erebus would be anointed with crystalline antimony that would confound Horus's senses when Erebus appeared to him, giving him the appearance of a trusted friend, familiar and beloved. In the final act to allow his passage to the void, and a step of the ritual unknown to him, Akshub would cut Erebus's throat and temporarily end his mortal life. The first chaplain would take the form of Hasta Sejanus, Horus's most favoured son, lost some years prior in a callous betrayal under the guise of parley. In the guise of Sejanus, Erebus would reveal to Horus that they were travelling in the Imperium, and that he would lead Horus to the truth of the great intelligences that dwelled in the warp. The disguised Erebus would claim only these powers could save Horus, and in return they wanted him to be their emissary. These powers, he claimed, had no interest in the material universe, and only sought to prevent the destruction of their realm by the actions of the Emperor. The false Sejanus would show the War Master visions of a future Imperium, where the Emperor was raised to godhood and some of his brother Primarchs venerated, but he himself was not honoured. Sejanus claimed the Emperor fought to destroy the old faith, not to free humanity from the shackles of religion, but to clear the path for his own rise to divinity. Erebus then showed Horus the creation of the Primarchs, questioning him on how the Emperor could have amassed the knowledge and skill to create beings as powerful as them. He told Horus that his father had bargained with and then betrayed the very gods of the warp whose existence he both denied and sought to end. He watched as the master of mankind appeared to allow the Primarchs to be scattered, without showing any care to intervene and save his sons. The final vision Erebus would show Horus would be of his homeworld Chthoniya, but this Chthoniya was from the future, where the Imperium no longer had the power to keep control of the overlords, and the Emperor was a carrion god uncaring for the fate of mankind. At this point, Magnus the Red would attempt to intervene and would strip the vision of Hasta Sejanus from Erebus to try to show that Horus was being deceived. However, Magnus would make the mistake of using sorcery to try to banish Erebus, and Horus would be left doubting both. Erebus would then reveal that he was not acting alone, but he was sent at the behest of Lorgar, one of Horus's closest brothers, to convince the War Master of the truth Lorgar had discovered, the knowledge of the Emperor's quest to ascend to godhood, and that he had sworn himself to the deities of the warp. As a result of his acceptance of their patronage, Lorgar had gained great power, but that was just a fraction of that which would be bestowed on Horus if he joined their cause, and became the new master of mankind. Magnus then made his second error in refuting the claim that Lorgar had turned from the light of the Emperor, but Horus knew in his heart that on this point Erebus was telling the truth, and one of his closest brothers had fallen. Horus made his choice. Erebus, the scar from his slit throat still fresh, would return to the warrior lodge on the vengeful spirit after the events on Davin and the apparent healing of Horus. It was Captain Trogodon that confronted him with the truth he and Gavriel Loken had discovered, but the ties of Astartes' brotherhood and the pleading of some of his Mourneville brothers stayed his hand in following up his threat to end Erebus's life. After the brief war to destroy the technocracy known as the Brotherhood, Horus would gather his closest commanders from both his Astartes and their associated Mechanicus forces, including the Legio Mortis and the army contingent. Erebus would of course be amongst this inner circle, as Horus revealed he would enact a plan to topple the Emperor from the throne of Terra and supplant him. Horus would reveal he had manipulated Leman Russ into using the Space Wolves not to bring Magnus before the Emperor for his use of sorcery, but to kill him on Prospero. He stated that Fulgrim and Lorgar's legions were already on his side and tasked Erebus with sending emissaries under the guise of the Chaplain Edict to spread the formation of warrior lodges in the other legions where loyalties could be probed in secret. As Horus schemed to execute his plans for Istvan, he would call on Erebus next to enact a ritual to allow the War Master to speak directly with the ruinous powers. Deep in the heart of the vengeful spirit, a stone-walled lodge had been erected in the image of the temple room of the Delphos. Now wearing the deep scarlet colours newly adopted by the Word-Bearers, Erebus would direct Horus in the sacrifice of his best astropath, Ang Mei Sing. Erebus would show his true understanding of the dark corrupted rituals needed to commune with the Chaos Gods, scratching designs of an 8-pointed star, 3 conjoined circles, a stylized skull, and the cuneiform runes of Colchis, all while chanting words from the Book of Lorgar. Erebus would call forth a being of shadow that would call itself Sarkel. This Lord of Shadows would confirm the Dark God's desire to see Horus replace the Emperor and cease his plans to destroy the realm of chaos. He also confirmed that they darkened the warp so that the Emperor and his legions would be blind to their actions, a level of power that could also be the War Master's to command. Horus weighed up Sarkel's words, but when he spoke he did not just blindly accept the creature's bargain. Instead, he elected to commit his forces to his plan on Istvan, and only when that was completed would pledge their allegiance to the Lord of Shadow's masters. Erebus would continue to advise Horus and pass on news delivered to him by the denizens of the Warp as the War Master prepared to commit the betrayal of the loyalist elements in his own legion, alongside those of his allies in the World Eaters, Emperor's Children and Death Guard in the Choral City on Istvan III. After the purging of the loyalists within the traitor legions on Istvan III, Erebus would reveal the plans for the next stage of the new crusade to the traitor commanders. New tattoos had been inked on his face that now proudly displayed his allegiance to the 4 ruinous powers. The need to hide now cast aside, even if he still didn't openly use their names. Erebus would inform the other commanders of their plan to occupy Sanguinius and the Blood Angels at Signum, although he was elusive of his true designs for the Angel and his son. He also passed on that the Ultramarines were assembling at Kauth, still unaware of the heresy unfolding, and too far distant to react when they did. The most numerous legion of Astartes were effectively off the board for now. Erebus would return to Lorgar's side, joining Argol Tal and Cor Pharon on the Fideus Lex for his Primarch's rallying speech to the traitor legions still believed loyal to the Imperium, the Iron Warriors, Night Lords and Alpha Legion, who alongside the Word-Bearers were soon to betray the Salamanders, Iron Hands and Raven Guard at the Dropsite Massacre on Istvan V. Following this, Erebus would also converse once more with Argol Tal. Tal and Erebus had a strained relationship over the years as Argol Tal, unusually for a protege of the first chaplain, had eschewed taking up the Crozius, and instead forged his own path in the Word-Bearers. Argol Tal was wary of Erebus, and speculated on what influences and ambitions the first chaplain had fed his Primarch over the 4 decades his fleet had been apart from the rest of the Word-Bearers. Erebus would inform Argol Tal that he knew all he had gone through when entering the Eye of Terror at the behest of Lorgar prior to his Primarch making the same journey. Surprisingly perhaps, Erebus simply told Tal that he was proud of him, and they prepared their forces for the betrayal to come. Erebus would be present alongside Tal, Cor Pharon and his Primarch on the surface of Istvan V as the final deception was revealed. When his Primarch had his final doubts while watching the fatal duel between Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus, Erebus was there alongside Cor Pharon to ensure Lorgar's compassion did not sway him from the course they had plotted for him all these years. He fought against the Raven Guard alongside Lorgar, telling him his fate was ordained on these fields of treachery, but he was not to face his brothers in combat directly. That fate and the pantheon they now served willed him not to confront Corax, even as he slaughtered his sons as the Raven Guard retreated. Lorgar would for once defy his advisors, but due to the fateful intervention of Conrad Kurz, the Aurelian would not pay for this with his life when Corax had him bested. After Istvan, Erebus would set out on the next step of his plan. The Anathema Blade had long been taken from the apothecarian of the sons of Horus by Fabius Bile, chief apothecary of the Emperor's children. Erebus was able to persuade Fabius to return the blade to him, and now he sought to unleash its power anew. Using ancient rituals torn from the minds of the Kinebranc metallurgists, Erebus fractured the sword, creating 8 smaller blades from the shards he split off. Each of the shards was presented to prominent members of the Word Bearers, including Cor Pharon. He would gather the bearers of the Anathema Blades on Davin to reveal their purpose. Erebus had spent the previous months in the company of Akshub, the priestess whose ritual had taken Horus into the Imperium after his wounding with the Anathema Blade, and who slit Erebus's throat in order for him to appear in the War Master's visions there. Erebus claimed the gods willed him to learn from her, to be able to first send his mind into the Imperium, and then to use the Anathema to pass physically through the veil that divides the material realm from the immaterium. However, she also knew his true goal to bring the rune storm that would spread across the galaxy and cut the Imperium in twain. A year had passed since Lorgar had tasked his closest commanders in the 17th to bring about the doom of the Ultramarines at Calth. Cor Pharon's plan had been long in the making, and Erebus prepared for the great spell he would unleash. His acolytes gathered, and the myriad of names of the Neverborn he would call forth committed to memory. As the rest of his legion made their way to Calth, the pieces were all falling into place. Eventually, Erebus would master cutting of the skein of reality and passing into the Imperium, shielding his mind from its ever-hungry denizens, and travelling further and further each time, until he could step from the surface of Davin directly into his quarters on the Destiny's Hand. He returned the same way, travelling clear across the Ultima Segmentum to appear in the temple on Davin. Now her usefulness to him was complete. Erebus would take his final revenge on Akshub. She did not resist as he slew her and then ate her heart. Erebus would accompany the other commanders and his Primarch to Calth and would meet Guilliman under the guise of the 2 legions working together and healing the rift caused by the raising of Monarchia. While the full story of the betrayal at Calth belongs in a future entry of the man who planned it, Erebus would complete his part in the task on the Satric Plateau, 2,000 kilometers north of Numinous City. A circle of polished black rocks taken from Istvan V, each marked with a sigil, were arranged in a perfect circle a kilometer in diameter. Progenitor glands harvested from the fallen at Istvan III and V were offered in a final blasphemy to the ruinous powers. The center of the ritual circle would cease to be anchored fully in the material realm, matter squirming as the membrane between realms was liquefied. The massacres being committed on Calth feeding into his dark ritual. Erebus would stand surrounded by the Neverborn, now able to pass into the material realm as the black stones of the circle throbbed with incandescent power. The howling wind carried notes like voices chanting the truth of Lorgar, the primordial truth. Reality was caving in, soon it would break. The Satric Plateau was bathed in aurora light as Cor Pharon's plan to destabilize Calth's sun succeeded, sending all its fell energy across the entire Viridian system. Rain fell on the ritual circle, a rain of blood, as the storm finally broke. Although not everything would go to plan on Calth, Erebus was satisfied his role was complete. The ruined storm would be a warp storm beyond anything witnessed since the Age of Strife. It would split the void asunder, divide the galaxy, and render vast tracts of Imperial space impassable for centuries. It would isolate and trap forces loyal to the Emperor, blocking their attempt to combine and support one another. It would even shatter communications between them, preventing any warning spreading of the heretical civil war breaking out all across the Imperium. With the runestorm rising, Erebus would use his Anathema dagger to cut a slit in the material fabric of the universe and step through to commence the next stage of his master's plan. The runestorm would not be the only action taken by Erebus on Calth, however, as he would also capture an ultramarine former librarian by the name of Tylos Rubio, and place into his mind the trigger to attempt to assassinate Malcador the Sigillite on Terra, when their paths would eventually cross there in years to come. Erebus would return directly to the Fideus Lex less than a week after the opening of the runestorm. He would be reunited once more with his Primarch and report to him on the matters at Calth. Erebus would be chastised by his Primarch for the failure of the Force to slay Rebute Guilliman and wipe out the Ultramarines, for losing half their fleet to the counterattack of the 13th, and abandoning tens of thousands of Lorgar's sons and mortal followers on Calth, despite his success in bringing about the runestorm. Despite the rebuke, Erebus would press his Primarch on the plans for Cygnus Prime. Erebus would state that both he and the War Master were confident they would either kill Sanguinius or turn him to their cause, and either way they could bring the Blood Angels onto the side of the traitors, either in loyalty or in grief. Lorgar would warn Erebus the attempt to corrupt the Angel would fail, just as Corphoron's attempt to illuminate Guilliman had failed, and dismissed his shocked first chaplain from his presence. Once Erebus had taken his leave, his pride badly wounded, Lorgar warned Argol Tal that Erebus would come to him soon with an offer, one he must refuse. Rightly enough, Erebus would approach Argol Tal, claiming to need his aid. Erebus would state he had walked 10,000 futures. In many of them the traitors lose at Terra. Horus falls and his forces are broken, not merely to be exiled, but torn from the annals of history. Erebus shared that for centuries a coven of individuals within the legions had stood at their Primarch's sides, guiding their movements and decisions, naming Callus Typhon in the Death Guard, and Fabius Bile in the Emperor's Children. But now he claimed Lorgar was slipping loose from their purpose. Erebus wanted Argol Tal to steer Lorgar back now that he and Corphoron had fallen out of favour and been banished from his side. He claimed in all futures where Lorgar manipulated events on his own, their rebellion failed. This is why Sanguinius must be brought to his knees on Cygnus Prime. When the Angel reaches Terra, most futures led to their doom. Tal would reject his request, but Erebus would impart one more prophecy, and this one Argol Tal guessed before it was uttered. Erebus wanted Khan to die when the time was right. But his true purpose on this calling on Argol Tal was not to kill the blood brother whom he had fought alongside in many a theatre of war. It was quite the opposite, to keep him alive until the moment fate decreed. In return, Argol Tal asked Erebus if he could bring back to life the Blessed Lady, the word-bearer's confessor who he loved, Cyrene. In his private quarters on the Fideus Lex, Erebus would complete the ritual to bring back Cyrene, and in turn Argol Tal would fight alongside the Berserk Khan on Neursia against the remnants of the Ultramarines that had chased after the word-bearers after Calth, using all his strength to keep the World-Eater captain alive. Only after the battle would Erebus return to Argol Tal and reveal his final deception to his former pupil. The ruinous powers had great plans for Khan, and several hours on the front lines protecting him had left Argol Tal weak. Erebus would then drive his Anathema Blade into Tal's spine in a killing blow that robbed him of his demonic connection. Khan would be free to follow his own destiny, free from the last bonds of brotherhood. Erebus would not completely escape retribution for this treachery. It would be Khan who would gain some measure of revenge on him, engaging Erebus in a duel in the fighting cages of Angron's flagship after the battle. Calling for Sanguis Extremis, Khan would strike Erebus a vicious blow across the chest, followed by severing his hand at the wrist and finally beating him down to place Gorechild against the first chaplain's spine. But before Khan could gun the trigger and rid the galaxy of his corruption, Erebus was able to draw his ritual knife and escape into the Imperium as the chain axe bit into only empty air. Erebus would next appear in the Cygnus cluster on the Word-bearer's vessel, the Dark Page, that was accompanying the Blood Angels' force led by Sanguinius himself. Both Erebus and Horus wanted the Blood Angels to join their cause, to lose themselves to the Red Thirst and follow the path of worship to Khorne. The difference was Horus saw Erebus as a fool for thinking Sanguinius could be turned much like Lorgar had warned him. The War Master wanted the angel to die on Cygnus Prime, and brought forth the greater demon of Khorne, the bloodthirster Ka'Bandha, to make that happen without Erebus's knowledge. Erebus went to the Cygnus sector believing he and the War Master shared the same goal, to use the Keeper of Secrets Chris the Perverse to bring Sanguinius over to the side of the traitors. At a citadel made of human bones from dead Cygnusti citizens from every planet and moon in the cluster, known as the Cathedral of the Mark, Sanguinius would face Ka'Bandha in desperate single combat. The demon would reveal Horus's treachery, and in that moment of doubt and grief the Bloodthirster would break from their combat, unleashing a rage fire that would slay 500 Blood Angels rushing to aid their Primarch in a single instant, the psychic shock sending Sanguinius into the darkness of the abyss. With Sanguinius incapacitated, his sons would descend into madness, slaughtering every cultist and demon that they would find on the planet. This scouring of the Heretic's forces caused some dissension between the two greater demons, with Chris still intent on following the Dark God's wishes, and the plan as Erebus understood it, to attempt to turn Sanguinius to their cause, and Ka'Bandha, much like Horus, convinced only his death would deliver his legion into the worship of Khorne. The full story of what occurred between Sanguinius and the greater demons, the rage fire and the birth of the Red Angel, is a story for another time, but the attempts to either turn or kill the angel were to fail, with the sacrifice made by the apothecary brother Meros to save his Primarch. Sanguinius would first defeat Ka'Bandha, tearing a wing from the Bloodthirster before throwing him into the temple's central pit to be consumed in warp fire. Chris would make its final attempt to corrupt the angel, using his love for his legion against him, but with Meros giving his life to take Sanguinius's place, the rage threatening to engulf the Blood Angel's legionaries forever subsided, and Chris's threats carried no further weight. The Blood Angels opened fire on the Slaneshi demon, and Sanguinius delivered the final blow, severing its head from its serpentine body. Erebus would be enraged that his master's plan to corrupt the Primarch of the Blood Angels had failed. He confronted Horus on the vengeful spirit, presenting him with the Red Angel as the only positive remnant of the failed endeavour on Cygnus Prime. Erebus berated Horus for breaking their agreement and unleashing Ka'Bandha without his knowledge to slay Sanguinius, accusing him of not wishing the angel to join their cause and becoming a potential rival to the War Master. He claimed the Ruinous Powers would be displeased their plan was not followed. Horus admitted he was disappointed Sanguinius had not died on Cygnus Prime as he had intended, and that he would now have to personally slay his brother, but Erebus would pay for his outburst of displeasure. Horus accused Erebus of believing he was a puppet, a weapon to be commanded much as the Red Angel was. He said Erebus needed reminding of his place in the scheme of things. Snatching the Anathema dagger from Erebus's waist, he said the Dark Apostle had let his mask slip, showing the face he showed to others, and he would see it again. Taking the blade, he drew a bloody line across Erebus's forehead, slicing through skin and the flesh beneath. Erebus did not cry out as Horus took the severed edge between his fingers and skinned Erebus's face from his blood-smothered head. The War Master held up his new trophy and said to Erebus, "The things that whisper in your ear, that you hold in concord with your pacts and your inscriptions, remind them they are not the architects of this war. I am." With this misstep, Erebus finally lost his influence over the War Master, and as he had already fallen out of favour with Lorgar, he became much more peripheral in the remaining events of the Horus heresy. For now, though, I am content. I am loathed by those I betrayed, and loathed by those I guided into betrayal. I have brought a War Master to the truth and cracked the galaxy's vaults to speed his armies. I have burned worlds and been burned by them, and who thanks me for this? This rebellion does not even bear my name, it bears the title of the Scorpion I stayed closest to, the most dangerous of a breed who would ever live. Now I observe my disgrace. I consider the wounds I have suffered and the pain that will dog me forever. I consider those that afflicted such ignominy upon me, and how they started their stories so nobly, and will end them in the gutter. They hate me not because of what I am, but because of what they were. They hate me because they turned and I did not. The records of our enemies call us all turncoats, but I changed no allegiance. I was always there just as I am now, aware of myself and the universe that made me. I lied with every breath I ever took except to myself. That is purity of a kind, and something that no other soul in this grand armada of renegades can boast. With his flayed face constantly bleeding beneath his helm as a reminder of his mistake, Erebus would continue to direct those acolytes that were still loyal to him. He would command his fellow Dark Apostle and former student Elias in the collection of certain weapons he said he needed to recover on the planet of Ranos. Elias misunderstood Erebus's instructions, seeking weapons similar to the Anathema Blades, but Erebus truly desired him to find the human psyker John Grammaticus, an agent of the mysterious Xenos Cabal, and the artifact known as the Fulgurite he had in his possession. Elias was to capture and hold Grammaticus until Erebus arrived. His mutilation at the hands of Horus and earlier in the duel with Khan meant he now sported a bionic hand, and although his flesh was starting to heal on his flayed face, the new skin growing there showed the mark of his dark masters. It was harder and darker. Tiny bone nubs now protruded from his skull, and his eyes had a visceral cast. Erebus was now consulting with a Lord of Change known as the Oracle, Kairos Fateweaver, to bring about the downfall of another Primarch, this time the Lord of the Salamanders, Vulcan. When he arrived, Elias had captured John Grammaticus, but Erebus betrayed his former disciple, using the Fulgurite to slit his throat before giving it back to the human psyker and telling him he was free to complete his task for the Cabal and kill Vulcan. The Dark Apostle would continue to scheme in the background of the heresy, using many guises to hide his true identity at times, advising Callus Typhon on how to doom the Death Guard and bring Mortarion into the service of Nurgle, and assuming the form of the Apostle of the Unspeaking, proving key in the ritual to open the way for the traitor Armada to emerge on Terra during the later stages of the Solar War. Erebus would then appear on Terra itself during the later stages of the siege, confronting the perpetual Urda in her home in Mauritania. Introducing himself with the title The Hand of Destiny, he attempted to sway Urda to join the ruinous powers, and claimed she was still revered by those who knew the truth. He claimed the Chaos Gods had guided Urda's actions that led to the scattering of the Primarchs, even if unbeknownst to her. Erebus and Urda would argue over the nature of the Gods of Chaos, but she refused his offers of power and his visions for the new order to come. With that final refusal, Erebus summoned a greater demon of each of the 4 ruinous powers to attack Erda. Erebus himself was left redundant in the struggle, unable to intervene as Erda showed her true power, defeating and banishing each of the demons in turn, but Erda was left bruised, lacerated and exhausted as her power ebbed away again. Erebus would offer her one last chance to live, to give herself to the ruinous powers and be raised up as a monarch by them. With her final refusal, he plunged his anathema into her flesh and ended her perpetual life. In the aftermath, he sensed that Erda had aided John Grammaticus and all Pearson's group, and set out to complete one last dark ritual. After the defeat of Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Erebus fled to the Eye of Terror with the remaining members of his legion. Despite his apparent fall from grace, with his Primarch Lorga meditating in the warp, Erebus became a member of the Dark Council, the ruling body of the remaining world bearers on the demon world of Sakaris in the Eye of Terror. Here he competes still with Corphoron for power over the remnants of his legion, plotting from the immense cathedral known as the Basilica of the Word, while Lorgar remains isolated from his sons in the Templum Inficio. He continues to plague the Imperium, leading his loyal acolytes in an invasion of the Pyrrhus Reach sector, and during the 13th Black Crusade sacrificing millions of Imperial citizens to summon a vast host of Neverborn to assail the Cadian sector. His continued existence is a stain on all the forces of the Imperium who know his true role in the heresy. Those with the knowledge of how he earned his self-given moniker, the Hand of Destiny, must surely be seeking a reckoning with one of the most reviled figures in the galaxy. I hope you've enjoyed our journey together, and I've earned your subscription today, and I'll see you again in the near future, where there is only war.